You're listening to the Mind Flipping Podcast, where you'll find tools and tips to help you renovate and update your mind and life.
Laura, thanks for being on the Mind Flipping Podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm excited to chat with you. As I mentioned a little bit before we clicked record, as I've listened to your podcast, which I love, which our friend Mark Ober turned me on to.
He's fabulous. I love Mark. He's amazing.
Yeah, Mark's a great guy. And for listeners, Mind Flipping podcast listeners that haven't heard, check out the episode with Mark Ober. It's really fascinating stuff. And Mark kind of came to his studies on consciousness and where does consciousness come from. Kind of the sparks were flamed, or the embers were flamed by listening to your podcast, right?
Yeah, he heard me first on another podcast, and then he listened to my podcast, and then he booked a session with me, which is pretty amazing. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and so listening, as he brought you up, I love the thought of the questions about consciousness and who we are, and all this stuff that happens in our mind that at times we want to flip because it's not working. And I love your guests, the range of guests. It's not only about consciousness, but it's about, taking care of not only our mind, our spirit, but our body as well, right?
Absolutely. Our physical health is very tied in with our intuition. The two major parts of the body that we use to access intuition and spirit are our gut and our brain. And if those aren't in good shape, then we're going to struggle to have mental peace, to access our intuition, to manifest. So that's why I focus on both, because I feel like they really go hand in hand.
And I've loved your recent podcasts about far infrared.
Oh yeah, far infrared sauna or near infrared sauna. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very cool. And again, so there's what starts as a physical energetic, but has an impact on us mentally, emotionally, spiritually. So typically I hop into conversations with my guests like you, not sure where they're going to go. I just let whatever comes up. And what comes up now is, as a psychic, a medium, somebody who's into tuning into levels of consciousness that perhaps some of us aren't or haven't been. Have you found that, on that note, on the physical side, that it's important for you to do things for yourself as far as your how you take care of yourself, what you eat or drink, to optimize your ability to do what you do?
Absolutely. So for me, opening up with my psychic abilities went hand in hand with a major shift in my health. And I actually, when I was going into the psychic work, I was in a major health crisis, actually. I, had been eating the sort of standard American diet and living this sort of traditional lifestyle. And by that, I mean like eating food that, generally speaking, is really unhealthy, and forcing my body to try to do things that probably doesn't want. And then, subsisting on caffeine and sugar and things to perk myself up afterwards. So what happened is I kind of had a crash and burn with my body, where I just all of a sudden, like, I had just been pushing, and my body just basically was like, nope, can't do that anymore. I developed a lot of health issues, leaky gut. I had allergies, chronic sinus infections, polycystic ovary syndrome. I was diagnosed as depressed. I had a whole host of issues. And I went to, doctors and tried to find out what was going on. And I really didn't get as much information from that sort of, track as I wanted. But I did get through alternative practitioners. And actually there is one recognized doctor who helped me a lot, and that is Dr. Oz. I was reading his book, You on a Diet, and it helped me with some diagnostic information. But what I realized through that process is that I had been not listening to my intuition, not listening to my body. And by the way, our bodies are an incredible avenue of information about what is going on with our psyche and our soul. And so when we get sick, when there's something off in our body, it's literally our body trying to tell us something that's for our highest good. So a lot of people get frustrated with their body. And I understand that, because sometimes we don't know how to decode what our body is trying to tell us. But really, my body was like, whoa, you need to stop and reassess and, switch what you're doing. And so I did. I completely changed my diet. I went through this process of trying to learn to understand better what was going to be aligned for my body. And so, for example, I'm highly reactive to wheat and grains, and anything that processes to sugar. So as I've opened up to my psychic abilities and done that for my work, I have really made massive shifts in terms of what I put in my body. So I don't drink any longer, no sugary foods. I, do the best I can to eat non-GMO and organic. Sometimes when I travel, that's not always easy,
Right.
but basically whatever you put into your body is having a really significant impact on your mood and your energy field, as well as your ability to tap into your spirit. And when I say spirit, I just mean like, what is aligned for you? What is going to be a good path? When you tap into this and your intuition, it helps you live a better and easier life, simply said.
I love it. Yeah. I'm just thinking of a couple things as you're talking about. I had a client earlier today. I'm 55. I think the client was about my age, and I was commending him on that he is investing in himself. He's kind of between relationships, and he's willing to spend time on himself. And what you're saying is, how important it is to listen to those signals, to not only treat our body with love and what we eat and drink, but to have a conversation, have communication with our body, and be open to what it's trying to tell us.
Absolutely. There's a book that's really about that by Louise Hay, called You Can Heal Your Life. And it's all about the sort of emotional, energetic aspects of different illnesses and body pain. And there is so much there. Again, sometimes it can take a bit to decode it and try to figure out what it is. And sometimes it's hard because what our body is telling us is something that we may not want to face. There may be people or situations that we are being guided to release. And sometimes that's painful, to release
Right.
people or certain situations, but our body is trying to tell us that. So one of the issues I have with some medical practices is that they're really just looking at the physical. And I feel like when you look at the underlying causes and emotionally and spiritually, that's when you really get at the root. That said, there are physical things that obviously impact us, and we have to address that. But in terms of true healing, I think a lot of times you have to dig really deep.
Yeah, makes sense. So about what age were you when you had the health challenges and had to look at how you were eating? And
I was 30. So I was 30 and, had been someone who had always been thin my whole life. And then all of a sudden I, had gained weight. I was 50 pounds heavier than I am now. And I was, counting my calories and exercising and doing all the things. And it just like wasn't coming off. And, I was also just in a real crisis in terms of my life as well. This happened, of course, during the recession when it was starting. And so, job situation was a mess. I was unemployed. I was in a bad marriage. So it was really like a crisis in every sense of the word.
wow.
And I think, when we have those kind of dark nights of the soul crises, we're often on the verge of a major breakthrough actually, if we can move through it, because it was because of the things that I learned from that experience that I'm having this amazing, life that I have now. And I don't know that I could have had that if I had those realizations that happened through all those experiences.
It's so cool. It's so true. We see it so often. It's like so difficult, if not impossible, to see it in the moment. But if we look
Right.
in others, we can have the hope that this shit I'm going through, there's something beautiful on the other side.
Exactly. It's not for nothing.
Right. So you mentioned there were a lot of things, career, financial, relational, as well as physical. Were you doing similar work? Were you doing energy work, psychic work? No?
Oh, no, that's a funny thing. So I've been very psychic ever since I was a little kid, but I actually thought that maybe I was crazy when I was growing up, and I didn't really address that. I didn't know how to handle it. And I didn't tell anyone because of my fears that maybe I was literally insane. And I remember asking my mom when I was a kid if she saw things, because I'm clairvoyant, I see ghosts and spirits and things like that. If she saw things, and I knew based on her responses, she didn't know what I was talking about. So I kept it to myself. And fast forward many years, and when I was in college, a family friend described a ghost that I'd seen but never told anyone about. So I
Wow.
knew at that point that I wasn't crazy because, someone else can't see my hallucination, right? That isn't how it works. But I didn't really know how to handle it. And even though that was in one way comforting, it was also terrifying in a different way, because that meant all this stuff was real and I did not feel like I had the tools to handle it. So I did the only thing that I knew how to do in my life at that time, which was to try to shut it out. And I was fairly successful in the sense that I did stop seeing and sensing most things. But essentially what I did was, instead of like dealing with whatever was happening, it was like I put a blindfold on, or like temporarily blinded myself or something. And then as a result of that, I not only shut out all the stuff that I didn't want to see, but I also shut out my own intuition. I was basically navigating blind. And that's how I ended up in the situation I was describing about when I was 30, when I was, I was in this very unhealthy marriage that then fell apart. I was in a career path that was not the most aligned for me. I was in politics and very ensconced in that world. And all of these things that just weren't aligned for my highest good. And so when I went through this sort of dark night of the soul, a lot of that was about like realizing that, and then having a major course correction in my life.
Wow. So in a lot of ways, all these things that were falling apart relationally, career-wise, physically, emotionally, you said you were depressed, your gut was leaking, all this was going on. Tell me a little bit about was it, all right, my body is failing. Was it like one thing after another? I'm taking care of my body. I'm stepping into the gifts that I've been given, or was it a gradual, all right, I'm going to take care of this. Now I'm not going to ignore, I'm taking the blindfolds off. How did that journey look?
It was a pretty fast kind of turnaround for me, where I'd been going to some sort of mainstream doctors, and it would be like, okay, you're depressed. Here, take this depression medicine. Oh, and by the way, I self-diagnosed after reading Dr. Oz's book, You Want a Diet About PCOS. And then I went to my OBGYN and said, do I have this? And then she like felt around and was like, oh yeah, you do. But I wasn't having a lot of help even with diagnostic stuff.
Wow.
And so once I figured some of these things out, I very quickly was like, wow, I need to find a different approach. And I started reaching out to alternative health practitioners who helped me understand, for example, that I was highly reactive to wheat and sugar, pulling me off of that. I had been a vegetarian for years, so I ate a lot of carbs, and it turns out that's actually the worst thing for me. I recently had, one of those DNA tests where they look at your health from a genetic perspective, and I'm what's called a slow carb processor. Like, I'm not built to have carbs well.
Wow.
So I did that. And then concurrently, I also, I went to a psychic myself who helped me with understanding how when I shut out my gifts, I shut out what I needed to know. And at the same time as I was sort of learning about diet and going to alternative health practitioners, I was also taking psychic development classes.
Nice.
And I invited angels into my life. I had this incredible angelic visitation experience. So for me, these two things are very concurrently happening.
So
and
what
they
happened?
transformed very quickly.
Yeah, I can see that. So what happened that allowed you to be open to it? Was it the fact that, all right, what I'm doing isn't working? Not only am I going to invest in myself physically, but I'm going to open up to my gifts. Like, did something happen where you just said, screw it, I'm going to go see a psychic. I'm going to accept the gifts that I have?
Yeah. I mean, like, my life was a mess, and clearly everything that I had done was not working. Like, I had lived the life that you're quote unquote supposed to live. I had the fancy job. I had worked at the president's office at the University of Colorado, and then I moved to Washington. I had the husband. I had was getting the advanced degree. I had the house. I had the like check all the boxes. And yeah, my life was a mess. So I think I recognized that clearly whatever I had been doing wasn't working. And honestly, I didn't know what else to do, but I reached out to a psychic myself because I was in this bad place. And when she explained to me about my gifts and shut everything out, it really resonated and made sense to me. And so that's when I set about going about the process of opening back up and taking classes. And by the way, I mean, I was terrified, just to be clear. Like, I'm great now, and I'm very comfortable with all this, but I worked in politics, in government. Like, this was not something that seemed like a good idea or safe. It was terrifying at the time, but at the same time, I was in such a bad place that it was kind of like, what have I got to lose? Like, I'm already at the bottom in pretty much every way.
Staying the way you were was more terrifying.
Yes, exactly. And sometimes that happens where, we stay in whatever is comfortable, even if it's really not the best for us until it gets so bad that we can't handle it anymore.
So when you were talking about, the psychic you saw encouraging you, I thought, oh, like that must have been a relief for you. Like, yes, I don't have to ignore this. And maybe a little bit, but it was also really scary.
Oh, totally. I
Yeah.
mean, one of the scariest things I've ever done in my life, and I'm quite fearless in my life as a general, saying, is that it was to come out and, tell people that I was psychic. Again,
Yeah.
being in political science, not having talked about this except for, with my parents when I was in college, it was really scary. And I feared rejection. I feared persecution. A lot of people who have psychic abilities have past lives where they have been persecuted. So I've been burned as a witch before, things like that, where our differences or kind of connecting with this realm has caused us, pain and suffering and sometimes death. And so a lot of people that have these abilities are still afraid as if they are in that same circumstance. And so that was really triggered for me. But what was interesting is that when I did start to talk about it, rather than people being critical, for the most part, people were really curious. They were interested. They wanted to know more. When people find out what I do, because it's still not a typical job, I will get asked so many questions. People have like a million questions for me. They just, if I have say a Lyft driver or something, they're just like,
Yeah.
and they find out, it's just like ask me questions the whole ride.
So on that note, what do you tell a Lyft driver? How do you describe yourself when they say, what do you do?
Yeah. Well, the way it'll frequently start is, I'll get in the car and I'm like, oh, I'm here for work. They'll ask me, what are you here for? I'm in traveling, oh, I'm here for work. What do you do? And then I just tell people I'm a psychic. And people are immediately, a lot of times they haven't even thought of that as something that you would do for work. And also people have a lot of, I think, stereotypes and associations with the psychic realm, and whatever you think a psychic is, you probably don't think that I look like one. I get that a lot. Like, and I will sometimes have people guess, and it's hilarious to see what people guess that I do. A lawyer is very common. People think that I'm a lawyer, or something like that. Maybe in pharmaceuticals or something. I've had that before too, which is kind of funny. But
Yeah.
and that's part of what I want to share with people. Psychics don't look like anything in particular. We all have access to this. And so whatever your sort of stereotype idea of a psychic, you can just throw that out the window.
I love it. Thanks for saying that. And it sounds very similar to, telling somebody you're a hypnotist or hypnotherapist. You get the what,
Yeah,
don't look me in the eyes.
exactly.
You get the
Yes.
curiosity, but you probably also get you get the comments like, what am I thinking right now? Or don't look me in the eyes, or,
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of misinformation, misunderstandings, and some things that are shown in film and television are somewhat accurate, and some are, of course, very dramatized and not like it is at all. So,
yeah.
yeah, and also we're so taught to be very logical and analytical, and tapping into this intuition kind of spiritual aspect is something that is even sometimes uncomfortable for people to think about. And on the lesser side, they just don't know about it. So I feel like that's a lot of what I'm here to do, is help people access it and understand just how important it is. I feel like we're living in a society where only like half the picture is kind of being addressed.
Okay.
That's like analysis and thought and mind, very important. And then there's like the intuition, feeling, spiritual aspect is almost completely developed for most people.
Yeah, it's interesting on that note. I'm trying to think how far back it goes. I was listening. So as a hypnotherapist, in our industry, there's a big core belief is that we have these automatic habits that come from our subconscious, these things that we do automatically. And our subconscious is in our brain, and we just need to reprogram, remind our subconscious that that old habit no longer works. We can step into a different habit. And sometimes just that simply having that conversation with our own subconscious or with the client can work, but not always. And so I was listening to an audio book from Michael Pollan about, I think, How to Change Your Mind or something like that. Talked
Great.
about,
He's great.
are you familiar with it?
Not that one, but his work in general. Yeah.
Yeah. And he talked about psychedelics and consciousness. And he brought up the question, where does consciousness come from? And which kind of opened my mind, like we are as hypnotherapists, as, so many people in the helping healing field, trying to help people with those subconscious habits. Well, what if those habits come from beyond their brain, their mind, their life?
Right. A lot of past life stuff comes up for people, for example.
Yeah, one of my guests, Martin Peterson, on the podcast, he got into hypnotherapy because somebody gifted him a past life regression session, and he thought he did it just, it was a gift, I'll do it, and was blown away by what he saw, and he verified a lot of it. Um, do you have any, I'd love to hear, anything you could tell us about your past life awarenesses or any client past life or mind flipping stories that you want to share?
Sure. Yeah, I think past life work is so profound. So I don't do regressions, but I do past life readings where, we look at people's past lives, and we can look at it from the perspective of either a particular issue that's coming up. It could be like a fear or phobia or a block that they have, a resistance to doing something, maybe being visible or writing or something. Also, you can look at it from a relationship perspective. So is there someone or a person in your life that's causing you a lot of triggering or angst, or you're having a hard time letting go of? And looking at the past life aspects for those situations is always so insightful. I had, one client who she was having a really hard time with her husband, and there were some unhealthy dynamics in the situation. And when I looked at a past life that they'd had together, he was literally a slave owner and she was his slave. And so some of those dynamics were carrying over, and she was having a really hard time establishing her boundaries and doing what she wanted to do. And it was like, well, no wonder, this is the pattern that you have with this individual. And I should mention that when we look at these past lives, it's very common for it to elicit a huge emotional release. So, in that session, this client was, crying, and it's like she knew immediately the truth to it, even though she hadn't known that before. Another client where during the first session with her came up that she had had this past life persecution and burned as a witch. And
Wow.
same thing, just a huge emotional release, like crying. And this client later went on to become a professional psychic herself, and now is well established. So these kinds of things can have a huge impact by allowing wherever we're holding pain or blockages in our life to come forward and be released. And then for me, it's quite interesting because with my psychic training now, I have access to looking at past lives very easily. Like I can just ask the guide, show me information about this topic or this person, like lives, and it just is shown to me very
Wow.
quickly. And so it's amazing because it helps you with moving through things more quickly. So in the past, when I didn't have access to this information, I might have, for example, was someone where I have a lot of karma and a tough pattern or situation that has developed. I might go through that same pattern, maybe to a lesser degree in this lifetime. And now I may look at that life, look at our pattern, be like, oh, I see where that's going. I don't need to go down that path. And so it at the very least, very, shortens the sort of process of that karmic pattern or lesson. And I have past life flashes of things all the time, and it's always fascinating. So
Like
sometimes I can
yours
look
or
at it.
client ones?
With both, but it obviously with me, because I'm with me a lot of the time,
Yeah.
or most of the time, versus focusing on others. I'll get just flashes, and ever since I was little, I've known some things that I knew certain periods or certain things that were resonant for me in terms of past lives. So ancient Egypt, for example, the London, Elizabethan London, these all are eras that were quite fascinating to me. And it turns out that there was a reason for that.
Wow. So for listeners that, whether they're new or longtime listeners that listen to the Mind Flipping podcast because they're hypnotherapists, maybe they're coaches, maybe they're into neuroscience, and this is probably only maybe the third or fourth podcast where we talked about past lives or a consciousness beyond our brain or beyond this lifetime. How do you how do you begin that conversation or explain it or both?
With people that kind of aren't familiar with
Aren't
it at some
familiar
level.
with it, like, what do you mean past lives, and
Sure. Well, I guess I'd just say, from my perspective as a psychic is probably different from a lot of people's, in the sense of that I know in my core that we do have these past lives, and essentially we incarnate over and over again to learn different things and have different experiences. But, from the perspective of counseling or psychotherapy, imagine that there's trauma, but that's been blocked out and you don't remember it. So that's what's happening for most people, is they have these major traumas or situations that are informing their behaviors, their choices, but they're not able to access it in terms of memory. And then what starts to happen is you open up, sometimes you start to have little bits of it kind of come forward if you're really open. Sometimes it's completely shut down, but either way, those things are impacting you. So if you can sort of reach in and dig in and uncover what's happening, and of course, psychotherapy tries to do this with this life, but the truth is that, you may have hundreds of lifetimes before that are also impacting us, and whatever happened in past lives is also informing what's happening now. So that's not to say that looking at this current life isn't helpful, but I find it's much more impactful and effective to look at these other lives that have created trauma or left patterns or beliefs in place that we can benefit from shifting and releasing.
Very cool. What comes to mind is that's where my fascination started. Just that question of, where does consciousness come from? And if consciousness isn't in our brain, it's with our spirit, our own, as Mark talks about, the whirlpool. We each have our own whirlpool in the river of love, of consciousness. And that whirlpool might be this body in this life, and then we float into the stream, the river, and come in another whirlpool in another life or in another form. But it helps explain why and how, things can change without us seemingly knowing why or how. Like, do you see that people shift when they come to you for a reading or for help or for coaching or guidance? That things are cleared up without a conscious understanding of how or why?
Well, sometimes even in just having a very simple addressing of something, it just releases that energy. So I have a lot of clients that I work with regularly and have for a long time, clients that I've had for 5, 6 years.
Yeah.
And I meet with them regularly. We do anything from looking at relationships to, business consulting. I work a lot with entrepreneurs and CEOs, things like that. But yeah, sometimes as soon as you address what that block is, even just recognizing it, sometimes just understanding that it's there will release it. And I'll speak to one from my own sort of past lives stuff. So I've always been afraid of sharks, and like really illogically so, meaning I had this fear. I would have nightmares about sharks and drowning, sharks swimming around me and things like that. And as a kid, my sister knew this. And so if we were in a pool, she'd say, "There's a shark in the pool." And she knew that it'd freak me out and I'd run out of the pool. Of course, there's not a shark in a pool. I'm not like in a James Bond movie. That's not what's going on, but even though I knew it was totally logical, the amount of fear that was generated from it was so strong that it would create this incredible response. And then as I started to learn more about this psychic work and past lives and phobias and how it can relate, I started to look at this and realize that I'd had many past lives where I literally was drowning or attacked by sharks and things like that. And simply in understanding that, so much of that went away. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm still not going to want to swim in like deep open water where there's sharks, but I don't have that like kind of uncontrollable, super strong fear that arises from the issue of sharks like I did. Just knowing that that was the cause of it, it's like it just released. So I think for people where they have, a gripping fear of something, it could be flying or speaking in front of crowds or strangling, whatever, that even in just looking at that past life and kind of acknowledging it, it can help release that block and the hold that fear can have on that person.
That's wonderful. It's almost as if just shining the light, bringing it to light, investigating, asking, being open to it, releases it. It's like, just wanted a little attention. This is where it came from. I'm here. You see it, you acknowledge it, and it releases.
Exactly. So, and just like the client that I referenced before, who had also been burned as a witch in a past life, and then immediately through that purge and release, she was able to step forward into visibility and into her power, and now is a pretty well-known psychic herself. So, it's amazing how one little thing like that can have this huge impact and ripple effect in the rest of your life.
That's a mind flip, and that's so encouraging. Such a gift of hope to know that it can be that simple, profound, wonderful. I love that.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be this long, drawn out thing. That's possible to have sort of massive shifting and healing happen very quickly.
And your life is a great example how quickly all of that happened, from the physical to the stepping into your gifts to the spiritual to the professional. A great example. Oh, there it is, the sound of speckling. That means it's time for the speckle round. Laura, are you ready for the speckle round?
I am. Let's do it.
All right. All right. First speckle round question, Laura. Do you have a word or phrase of the day that you'd like to share?
Sure. So 2 words that have been coming up a lot for me are faith and courage. So the faith to believe that you can have what you want in your life and that it's possible, and then the courage to move forward and move through that fear and just know that, you don't have to live in that place of fear.
So is that a common theme with clients, with people you work with, that it's hard for them to step into those?
Oh, sure. I think there's so much that is holding us in these old patterns from past lives, like we were just talking about, old patterns that we've been in for many, many lifetimes. And imagine it like you've been on this path, and there's almost like this rut created from, been doing this for so long. And then it's like, how do I like pull out of that? It's hard to get out of a rut. And that includes from past lives. And then you also add on top of that, the societal messages that we receive, and many societal messages are very unhealthy and untrue, especially from a spiritual perspective about, what it is it's okay to do or pursue or be. And so it can feel very difficult and bring up a lot of fear of rejection, of failure, of not being loved, that we're not worthy. All these kinds of things come up when we step into our bigger vision for ourselves.
Yeah. And when we've been hearing or feeling or sensing those messages through our society and culture, to step away from that is a little scary because it's ingrained in us, and that's just in this lifetime.
Absolutely.
And I envision or imagine it as, like, to your point, for how many lives or for how long have you been wearing this cloak? And now you have to be courageous enough to take it off, and and I can imagine coming from a political arena, and now you're going to get into the work you do. That had to be
Right.
incredibly fearful.
Yeah, I think there's that, and there's how other people are reacting around you. We are in a world where most people are living this way, where they're operating from a place of fear and limitation. And what happens when people are in that place is typically they're afraid, but they want company, and so they want people to be with them and stay where they are.
Yeah.
And so that's what happens when other people start to break free of that. They will frequently try to grab them and kind of hold them in place. So I describe that as the crab mentality. Are you familiar with that? Like how crabs operate?
I mean, I can just imagine that they're trying to pull each other in.
Yeah. So like if you put crabs in a bucket and one starts to crawl out, the other crabs will pull the crab back in. Right. It's like, oh, wait, you can't, I'm here. You have to stay here too. Like kind of situation. And so, it's something that can be very tough if you're surrounded by people like that, where you're trying to step forward and, go into a bigger, better place. And the people in your life are trying to pull you back. And, then a lot of times there's a lot of releasing that has to happen in order for us to really, step into the life that we want to have.
Rise above, step out of the bucket, step into your own light, your own beauty. I love it. Very cool. All right. Another spackle round question. Let's see here. What have you always known about yourself?
Gosh, I've always known that I was here before this life. My first memory is actually of the other side. So I remember being in a circle of white beings, and basically it was like, hey, it's time. And what that meant was it's time for me to incarnate. And I remember being like, oh God, here we go. Like I knew that it was going to be tough. I was born into an abusive situation. And I had, as I explained, some really tough things that I learned through my marriage and just health and et cetera. But yeah, I've always known that I was more than just this form. And what's interesting is that I think as a soul, I'm learning how to access that sort of female intuitive side, the feminine receiving side more. So I'm very comfortable accessing the male side of my personality or soul. And I have a lot of lifetimes as a man. So, and it's funny because, growing up, I would be like the one girl hanging out with like a dozen guys. like literally this kind of thing. This will happen all the time where it's like me and a bunch of men.
Yeah.
And I think that's because I'm just very comfortable with that kind of energy. And even me being a psychic is because on a soul level, I'm trying to learn better how to access that for myself even as well.
To balance it out, to tap into the feminine side more.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think I remember hearing you say that on one of your podcasts about, that you've always been in touch with that masculine side. And I thought it's kind of funny. It's the opposite of me. I was raised with 3 sisters, my dad passed when I was 13, and I've always had female friends and people that know me. I'm not ashamed to say I'm sensitive and I'm in touch with my feminine side. Very interesting. The opposite.
It is. And it's funny, if you look at me, like I'm very feminine in terms of my form, like I'm, very
Right.
femme, my style, my appearance and everything. But in terms of personality and how I approach things, it often is, I guess, more traditionally male. But that said, the whole aspect of me understanding the importance of intuition and the feminine aspect has been really important, because when I didn't do that in my life, that's when my life, kind of fell apart, so to speak. So yeah, it's really important to have balance and that both sides are important.
Very interesting. Very cool. Yeah. And I'm 6'5", and, and I have facial hair. I mean, I think I'm masculine, but
Well, yeah, again, like I look very feminine, but a
yeah.
lot of it's about the energy,
Yeah.
inside. And yeah, but it's actually good. I think all of us are learning to do this, and we have areas of strength, and wherever we're learning is where, it can feel like a struggle, or where there's more efforts. What we've learned already, that's what we're, that's the easy stuff.
Right. Right.
The hard part is when we haven't.
Go into those uncomfortable areas. So you've always known that this is a new form, that you existed before. You said that's kind of your oldest memory, your earliest memory.
My first memory, that I can associate with this lifetime is literally like right before I was born.
Wow, that's
And
so
then
cool.
even very quickly, I would say, past life flashes, or just knowledge about certain other lifetimes, that I just always knew was there. And again, what we're just talking about, like thought of myself, as a man, like sometimes when I would dream, I'd be a man, and, things like that.
Yeah, that's so cool. So flip side is, what have you discovered about yourself more recently that you didn't always know or understand or believe?
Oh boy. I think just the extent to which our thoughts are not our thoughts is really significant. I'd be curious to hear your perspective on that, doing what you do. But the more I understand about the psychic realm and spiritual realm, the more I understand that our thoughts are really a combination of what we are thinking and feeling, what our guides are thinking and feeling, what our, family, people that we love or know are thinking and feeling, what a ghost might be thinking and feeling. And then there's things called entities, which are, I think of them as energy parasites, beings that feed on fear, anxiety, pain, chaos, depression, etc. And so that our thoughts are such a combination of all these different things. And, I think it's challenging because, like when we're talking right now, I can tell when you're talking and when I'm talking. There's a very clear delineation, but our thoughts are such a like jumble and mix of all of these things. And yet most people tend to take ownership and assume that everything that is their thought, and I'm putting that in quotes, is theirs. And the truth is anything but. So in my experience, in some cases, depending on how telepathic you are, for example, 80 to 90% of your thoughts may be externally created. I mean, it's huge. And so it's really important, so that when you have negative thoughts about yourself, about others, so, critical thoughts, any thoughts that are about, shame or negative outcomes or fear or worry, that you really take pause, think about, is this coming from me? And if you're not sure, then regardless, the next step is like, do I want to participate in this? Is this something I really want to have in my mind? Because I found that it's very much like a conversation. If someone says something hateful to you, you can just kind of be like, okay, I'm just kind of letting that go. But as soon as you kind of argue and become involved in it, it does become yours. Like you become a part of that conversation. So in terms of thoughts, if you can just pause, think, is that mine? Do I want to engage with it? If not, I'm going to release that. I'm not going to kind of continue it. then that can really go into changing your life in really dramatic ways, because most people don't think about that. They just kind of continue that conversation. They get bogged down in fear and negativity and worry. And worry is very much like praying for what you don't want to happen. You're putting energy, manifesting energy into something that is not your desired outcome. And when that happens, it does have an impact on our lives. So the more that we can redirect and release that stuff that isn't what we want in our life, in our emotional and energetic fields, then really transformative things will start to happen in your life.
So would you say that this is more of a new awareness, a new discovery, a new understanding about our thoughts for you?
I think I've had it for a long time. When I was first discovering this, I started to realize it was like a brand new realization for me.
Sure.
And so, for example, one time I remember I was walking down the road and I heard a thought, and again, I'm putting that in quotes, that was like really negative with cursing and like racial epithets. And I was like, that doesn't sound like how I think, that's not me. Yeah. And so it was just so strong that I was able to then be like, wow, that's fascinating. That is clearly not mine. But it can be very subtle. And I think I've recognized it when it's strong, it's not mine, but even the little subtle kind of sabotaging thoughts and things like that can come in, that I used to think, well, I'm not sure. And now I recognize like, oh yeah, I'm sorry, my water bottle just fell. It's like really windy all of a sudden. That's not mine either. And so what I've come to understand is that anything that isn't, positive, peaceful, loving is usually coming from outside of us, and it's usually impacted by, these kind of entities and negative energy forms that I was talking about.
I love that. I love that as a guiding, a compass. Like, if this isn't loving, it's not from me.
Right.
And do I want to own it? And I think it fits really well into the analogy of, consciousness being the river and the whirlpools. And so if our being, our sense, our thoughts are part of the whirlpool of that river, sometimes that water gets in there. And I haven't really thought about it like that. And that's pretty fascinating. And it may help. And I don't know if both time-wise and for other reasons we want to go there, but it may also help explain a little bit of mental illness,
Absolutely.
to subtle degrees or to extreme degrees, that, this isn't them, me, her. It's, something else. It's beyond.
I'd love to share a little story about that, if that's all right. So when I was still pretty new as a psychic, and I communicate regularly with angels, it's part of my work. And I was in Los Angeles. I was there on a trip before I moved there. And I just got the message from the angels to ask for extra protection, kind of psychically, spiritually. And I did. And a few moments later, there was a man that ran by, and he was what I'm sure we would think of as mentally ill, perhaps schizophrenic or something. I'm not sure. But, he had a shopping cart and he shoved it at some people. He was like punching the air. And from most people's perspective, he was reacting to nothing. But from my perspective as a psychic and clairvoyant, I was seeing that he was being attacked by these entities, wow. And he was reacting physically because that's all he knows how to do. But of course, they're not physical beings. So you shove a shopping cart, you punch them, they don't do nothing happens to them. They, in fact, because he was in fear and anger and rage, they were then feeding on that. So it was like this feeding frenzy on him, energy. So that's a really extreme case. And when someone is that far impacted, for example, I don't think there's really anything that I could do. I just ask the angels to help them however they can. But this is happening into much lesser levels for most people, where there are still beings, maybe not quite as strong, but beings that are impacting and feeding on their fear of anxiety, their stress, immobility, lack of passion or creativity. And they're very subtle and will sometimes, plant just a little seed of doubt, or you'll have an idea, oh, I'm going to do something and this could bring positive change in your life. And they'll plant a thought like, oh no, don't do that. You'll just fail, or, whatever it is. And then they continue to feed on that energy that they like. So again, like energy parasites. And if you stop giving them the food that they want, then, they'll move on. And so it's really important not to engage these and give them what they want, not only because it's, feeds them, but also because we're not in the best life or position that we could be when we do that.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. That's really empowering. I think it gives people hope, and it gives us the awareness that we don't have to own all of our thoughts. We can pause. Earlier today in the office here, I had a conversation about mindfulness and how that practice gives us the ability to pause, to create that space between stimulus and reaction, that instead of reacting, we can respond. And that even comes to thoughts, that just simply that thought, as you say, we can choose to question it.
Right.
Is that mine?
Yeah.
Do I want it to be mine? Do I want to own it?
Yeah. And the truth is our thoughts are very powerful, and they will frequently lead to action or, physical things. So it's actually really profound when you start to acknowledge it, because the thoughts will often lead us to make or not make certain decisions or take action, etc. So if you can stop it at the thought. And one of the books that helped me with understanding this is Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, just this idea of you are not your thoughts. And then I would take it one step further to say your thoughts are not even necessarily originating from you.
Yeah, that is the next level. I brought up that book with that client. I'm like, we were talking about,
yeah, it's great.
The past is history, and we don't,
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow's a mystery, but all we have is now. And to your point, what do we have now? We have our thoughts, and even that may not be totally ours.
Exactly.
It's so cool. It's so wonderful. It's so powerful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I love it. Well, we could obviously talk forever, but I do want to respect your time and our listeners. So let's wrap things up. And as we do, I think, did you say you have maybe a meditation that you wanted to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I have one. It's a grounding and clearing meditation, and it's a great way to simply clear out all the energy that you take on during the day. It helps with clearing away those thoughts, because a lot of times with that energy comes various thought forms. And, we're very taught to take care of our physical body. We brush our teeth and take a shower and, wash our faces and whatever. But we're not frequently taught to take care of our energetic or spiritual cleanliness. And that's what basically this does, is help you clear away and clean your energy field.
Grounding and clearing meditation. I love it. So we'll put a link or a way to get that in the show notes at mindflipping.com for this episode with Laura Powers. And if somebody wants to get hold of you, what's the best way for them to get hold of you, Laura?
Sure. For my psychic and health work and podcast, which is Healing Powers Podcast, you can find all of that on my website, healingpowers.net. My books are also linked there, my courses, and also you can find information about how to work with me on the services page.
Healingpowers.net.
Yes.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for today. I mean, we went so many places. We could go so many more, but I know that you offered hope, you offered enlightenment, and I want you to know that not only do I appreciate you, but I love you. Thank you, Laura.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And just real quickly, since we didn't mention it, I do have 7 books on all these things. So if you want to dig a little deeper, that's a great way. And I'm really passionate about manifesting. I have a manifesting course in particular that I love to mention. And I'm here now at a client's house in Maui. I travel full time. I've manifested this amazing life for myself. And I just want you to know, whatever you vision for yourself, even if it doesn't seem like it's likely or possible, there's so much more that's possible. Dream big and just know that you can have it.
That's fantastic. And listeners may have heard, if they missed it, I'm going to put it in. And as listeners may know, and Laura and I talked about, I do my intros afterwards. I'll put that in there. So be sure to check out the books that I mentioned. Laura's got some recent ones. Check out her manifesting course. She's the perfect model of manifestation. So
thank you.
thank you, Laura.